The morning Colt Mercer arrived at the Joint Counterterrorism Selection Program, nobody looked up. That was the first thing he noticed. 47 people in that intake yard, every one of them trained to read a room, and not a single set of eyes tracked him as he stepped off the transport van. They were too busy sizing each other up, too busy measuring, too busy doing the thing that men in rooms like this always do, calculating where they stood in the hierarchy before anyone had spoken a word. Colt set his bag down, looked at the mountains. The Blue Ridge in late October is not beautiful the way postcards make it look. It is something older than beautiful. The ridge lines run like the spine of something enormous and ancient, and the forest at that elevation has already gone the color of rust and ember, and when the wind moves through it, the sound is not like wind at all. It is like breathing, like something enormous taking its time. He stood there for 11 seconds. Then he picked up his bag and walked to the back of the registration line. The facility sat in a shallow bowl between three ridges, one road in, one road out. The buildings were low and gray and arranged with the kind of deliberate spacing that told you whoever designed this place had done so with fields of fire in mind. Every camera angle covered, every approach accounted for. The people who built this knew exactly how an enemy would come, and they had made certain there was no good angle from which to do it. Colt clocked the cameras out of habit. Southwest corner, northeast corner, two on the main building facing the yard. The one covering the auxiliary structure near the tree line was angled slightly wrong, tilted maybe 4 degrees off center. Could be a mounting error, could be intentional. He filed it and kept walking. The man behind the registration table was young and nervous and handed Colt his packet without looking at him. Trainee designation, Mercer C. Specialty classification, civilian track. Assigned bunk building C room 14. Civilian track. He heard someone laugh low and mean from somewhere behind him. He didn't turn around. His room was small and smelled like industrial soap and old wood. One window facing north overlooking the tree line. He set his bag on the lower bunk, unzipped the top pocket, and placed a single photograph on the shelf above the headboard. Two people in the photograph. A soldier in desert camouflage, lean and straight-backed, with a particular posture of a man who does not know how to stand in a way that isn't ready. And a boy, maybe 4 years old, sitting on the soldier's shoulders, with both hands gripping the man's forehead like reins. The boy is laughing with his whole face. The soldier is not laughing, but the lines around his eyes are doing something close to it. On the back of the photograph in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper, Blue Ridge, 1994. Never quit. Colt looked at it for a moment. Then he went to find the dining hall. The first full day began at 0500. Physical assessment, land navigation, weapons qualification, medical screening, the kind of day designed not to test what you know, but to expose what you are when you're exhausted and cold and someone is timing you. The instructors watched everything and wrote down almost nothing, which meant they were watching the things that couldn't be written down. Colt finished the land navigation course 11 minutes ahead of the next trainee. He was not trying to finish first. He had simply read the topographic map the way his grandfather taught him, not looking for the path, but looking for the land's intention. The land always tells you where water goes. And where water goes, there are trails. And where there are trails, there are the shortest distances between 2 points that human feet have been calculating for centuries. He came in, handed in his marker card, and sat down in the shade of a pine tree with a tin cup of water. 3 minutes later, Marcus Dolan came through the finish line. He was large in the way that some men are large, not just in size, but in the space he took up. 6'3" and 230 pounds, with a jaw that looked like it had been installed as load-bearing architecture. He had done 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and his body had been shaped by that experience, the way a river shapes a canyon, slowly, completely, without apology. He saw Colt sitting there, and his face did something brief and complex. Then it went neutral. Colt looked at his cup of water. That night in the dining hall, the seating had already arranged itself in the way it always does when you put 48 competitive people in a room with assigned tables and unassigned loyalties. Former SEALs on the east side, Rangers clustered near the far wall, the FBI contingent in the center, various others distributed by instinct, by gravity, by the invisible physics of shared experience. Colt sat at a table near the window alone. This was not an accident. The window faced the auxiliary structure. The table gave him a clear line of sight to it while appearing to face the room. From this position, he could see the door of the auxiliary building, the camera mounted above the dining hall entrance, and the table where Marcus Dolan sat eating with his 2 constants. The first was a man named Derek Briggs, who had served with the Marines and was built like something that had been assembled specifically for the purpose of occupying space and making other people aware of it. He did not speak much. He did not need to. His presence was its own complete sentence. The second was a former SWAT officer named Reeves, who had the particular quality of a man who uses friendliness the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with precision for specific purposes, never out of genuine warmth. He smiled often, his eyes cataloged constantly moving through the room in smooth, professional arcs, filing everything. Reeves was the one who started the first conversation about Colt 2 tables away, loud enough to carry. He didn't use Colt's name. He said the words civilian track the way you say a punchline you've used before, and no works, and the men around him made the sounds that men make when they want to laugh, but are disciplined enough not to. Colt ate his food. He had been told many times by many people that he had a quality of presence that made other people uncomfortable without him doing anything specific to cause it. His grandfather had articulated it differently. He had said, "Boy, most men move too much. Moving is a habit. Learn to be where you are." He was where he was. The next morning, the CQB simulation exercise was announced. Close quarters battle, 6-person teams, 12-room structure, moving targets, timer running. The kind of exercise that reveals coordination above individual skill. You can be the best shooter in the room and still cost your team the scenario if you don't know how to move through a fatal funnel without telegraphing your position to everyone inside it. The teams were assigned. Colts included a man named Garrett Calloway, who had come over without introducing himself the evening before and simply sat down across from Colt at the window table, picked up his fork, and started eating. Calloway was 34, had done 2 tours in Iraq with 5th Special Forces Group, and had the kind of competence that announces itself without words, the way weight announces itself when you pick something up. He had simply appeared at Colt's table the way a man might lean against a wall that seems structurally sound when everything else is wobbling. They did not discuss the exercise. They did not need to. At the entry point before the team went in, Colt spent 20 seconds doing something that made the man to his left visibly impatient. He looked at the building, not at the door at the building, the angle of shadows from the windows, the faint movement of a curtain in the 3rd room from the left 2nd floor, the configuration of the roof vents relative to what he could infer about the interior floor plan. Then he laid out the movement pattern with hand signals. No words. Calloway looked at the signals, looked at Colt, and gave a single nod. They cleared the building in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 0 simulated casualties. Stone's team took 6 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 casualties. The weapons qualification came that afternoon on a range that looked deceptively simple, until you noticed that the wind came in unpredictable cross-gusts off the ridge above, and the targets were set at distances that made standard compensation calculations unreliable without real-time adjustments. The M24 SWS felt exactly the way he knew it would feel. He had grown up with its predecessor, which his grandfather kept clean and stored in a case beneath the workbench in the shed behind the house in Tennessee. Iron Bill had not kept it as a memento. He kept it as a tool maintained and ready, the way a man keeps a reliable hand plane if he is serious about woodworking, because some tools are not museum pieces. Some tools are tools. The conditions that afternoon: wind approximately 15 knots from the west-northwest, temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit, target at 800 meters, light precipitation, beginning. Colt took his position, settled into the stock, and did not immediately look through the scope. He looked at the grass at mid-range first. The way it moved told him more about the wind's behavior between him and the target than any instrument. His grandfather had taught him to read grass the way other men read gauges, with complete trust in the information it provided if you knew how to ask. He made his calculations, not on paper, in the way that long practice makes available directly, simply the same way a carpenter estimates a distance without measuring it. 5 rounds. 5 impacts in a group that the qualification instructor, a weathered man in his 50s named Kowalski, who had the demeanor of someone who had stopped being impressed by most things several decades ago, could cover with his palm. Kowalski looked at the target for a long time. Then he looked at Colt. Then he made a mark in his notebook and moved on without speaking. That night, Reeves escalated. It was surgical in the way that psychological operations are surgical when they are executed by someone who understands the medium. Not a confrontation, not anything that could be pointed to, just words moving through the facility. The way smoke moves, you don't see it travel, you just notice it has arrived somewhere new. The words were simple. This one is a plant. Civilian track, no service record, top scores, you do the math. Someone put him here for a reason, and it is not the same reason we are here. By dinner, Colt could feel the shift in the room without looking for it. The temperature of a group of people changes when their opinion of someone changes in the same way the temperature of a body of water changes when a current shifts below the surface. You don't need a thermometer. You just need to have spent enough time in the water. He ate his food. The following morning, Briggs knocked over Colt's coffee in the equipment library. The library was a narrow room with long tables and fluorescent lighting, and shelves of binders containing tactical doctrine, weapons manuals, area study packets, and equipment specifications. Colt was reading a 30-year-old field manual about mountain operations that he had found on the lowest shelf behind newer publications, the kind of document that gets replaced rather than updated because the terrain it describes does not change. The coffee went across 3 pages. Briggs said nothing. He looked at Colt with the particular expression of a man waiting for a specific response. Colt looked at the coffee, looked at Briggs, reached for the small towel he kept clipped to his bag, a habit his grandfather maintained throughout his life, because a wet document has cost more operations than enemy fire, and quietly blotted the pages, spread them to dry, and went back to reading. Briggs stood there for a moment. Then he left. Calloway appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, sat down across from Colt, did not comment on the spreading coffee stain, picked up a binder, and started reading. The afternoon of the 3rd day was the first time Stone spoke directly to Colt. Not in the simulation space, not on the range. In the narrow corridor between the main building and Building C, where the light came in at a low angle that made it difficult to see faces clearly from one direction, while the other had full visibility. This is not the kind of thing that most people notice. Colt noticed it immediately and adjusted his position without appearing to. Stone said, "You're good at tests." Colt said, "I like tests." Stone looked at him. "Tests aren't the same as the real thing." "No," Colt said, "they're not." Something moved across Stone's face, not anger exactly, something more complicated, something that lived adjacent to anger but had deeper roots. He walked past without another word. Calloway was waiting at the end of the corridor. He fell into step with Colt and said quietly, "He is going to make a move soon." Colt said, "I know." "You're not worried." It was not quite a question. Colt answered it anyway. "There are things worth being worried about," and he said. "He is not one of them." Calloway looked at him for a long moment. "Where did you learn to fight? Because the way you move in those simulations, that is not civilian martial arts. That is something else." "Something old," Colt said. Calloway thought about that. "Old school," he said finally. "Got it." And that was how that friendship began. Without ceremony, without backstories shared. Just 2 people recognizing something in each other that did not need to be named to be understood. The dining hall was at capacity when it happened. Every seat filled. The cafeteria-style line backed up almost to the door. The smell of institutional food and damp outerwear, and 48 people who had spent the day outside in cold rain. The noise level was what it always was at that hour, significant, various, covering everything beneath it. Colt had his tray and was moving toward the window table when the tray left his hands. He did not see it leave. He felt it, the specific momentum of an impact from the left side, the particular physics of a loaded tray struck from below, the way food distributes itself across a floor with a kind of democratic enthusiasm. The room went quiet. It did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in concentric rings, starting from the point of impact and moving outward as silence always does when something is about to happen, and everyone within range understands it. Stone was standing in the space where the tray used to be, close enough that Colt could see the slight elevation in his jawline that happened when he was managing something internally. The control of a large and powerful man who has learned that the threat of force is sometimes more effective than force itself. "Pick it up," Stone said. The room was completely quiet now. 46 people watching. In the far corner doorway, the one that opened to the administrative corridor, Colonel Dwight Stannard stood with his arms at his sides. He was not moving toward the situation. He was observing it. There is a difference between those 2 things, and it matters enormously, and Colt filed it in the same place he had filed the camera angle and the empty auxiliary building and the 4-degree tilt that nobody had bothered to fix. Colt looked at the floor. He looked at the tray. He looked at the food distributed across the linoleum in the specific pattern that physics had selected for it. Then he looked at Stone. He stood up. Not quickly, not slowly. At exactly the pace a man stands up when he has decided something that has nothing to do with the person in front of him and everything to do with himself. He was taller than Stone expected. The posture was wrong for someone who was afraid. The posture was wrong for someone who was performing confidence. It was simply a posture neutral-centered, occupying exactly the space available without claiming more or retreating into less. Stone moved first. The hook came from the left, a powerful practice strike that had ended other confrontations cleanly and quickly, aimed at the orbital bone above Colt's right eye. It carried the entire weight of Stone's size and training and anger, which was considerable. It arrived at empty space. Colt had moved his head 2 inches to the right, not dramatically, not as a performance. Precisely the minimum distance required for the strike to pass without contact and no further. The left hand came up in the same motion, not blocking, but redirecting, catching Stone's forearm on the outer edge and using the momentum of the strike's follow-through as raw material. The right hand went to Stone's shoulder. One step, a rotation of the hips. The use of Stone's own considerable forward energy as the primary mechanical force. The floor arrived very quickly for Marcus Dolan. He went down flat, and the sound of it was the sound of a significant weight hitting solid linoleum, and he lay there with his body processing what had happened at a speed somewhat slower than it had occurred. 4 seconds. Total. Colt stood over him and looked down. "I am not here to fight you, Stone," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that only the people nearest could hear it, but the room was still quiet enough that it carried. "But I will if I have to." He picked up the tray, walked to the serving line, got a new plate of food. In the far corner doorway, Colonel Dwight Stannard watched all of this with an expression that was very carefully neutral. He did not intervene. He did not call for order. He made no notation visible to anyone in the room. He simply observed, and then he stepped back into the administrative corridor and disappeared. At the table near the east wall, former SEAL with close-cropped gray hair and the particular quality of someone with a long institutional memory looked at what had just happened and gave a very small, very precise nod. The kind of nod that means, "I know what that was. I know where it came from. I know what it means about the person who did it." That night, Colt sat on the edge of his bunk. The room was quiet. His roommate, a former SWAT officer from Georgia who went to bed precisely at 2100 and slept without apparent difficulty, was already still beneath his blanket. Colt reached into his bag and took out the photograph. He looked at his grandfather's face for a long time. William Mercer had not been a loud man. This is the thing people always got wrong when they tried to understand him from the outside. They heard the title Delta Force 4 Combat Deployments, 2 classified operations that had no official record, and they constructed a certain kind of person. Hard, certain, brittle in the way that men who have seen too much sometimes become brittle. That was not Iron Bill. Iron Bill burned rice. He burned it regularly with an enthusiasm that suggested the problem was not inattention, but some fundamental incompatibility between his particular relationship with time and the specific requirements of cooking starch in boiling water. He had strong opinions about baseball that were undercut by his inability to remember the names of players who were not active during his own youth. He read history the way other men watched television compulsively late into the night, unwilling to stop at a reasonable point. And when Colt was 6 years old, this man sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I am going to teach you some things. Not because the world is dangerous, though it is, because you should know where you come from." The things he taught: how to read ground, how to find water, how to move in a way that did not announce you were moving. The mathematics of ballistics made comprehensible through repetition and practice rather than formula. The physiology of attention, what the body does when it is startled, what the eyes do when they are looking without seeing, and how to use both. Judo first because it teaches the use of another person's force rather than opposition to it. Then Krav Maga learned from a retired instructor whose name Iron Bill never mentioned and whose methods were entirely practical and without aesthetic concern. And when Colt was 14, the rifle. Not as a trophy, not as a tradition the way some families treat firearms, as a tool, as a skill. With the same attitude Iron Bill brought to everything he considered worth learning: complete seriousness, zero sentiment, patience without limit. By the time Colt was 18, he could put 5 rounds inside a circle the size of a coffee cup at 600 meters in moderate wind. Iron Bill watched him do it one autumn morning, handed him a cup of actual coffee, not burned for once, and said, "The most dangerous man in the room is never the loudest one." He died when Colt was 20. Official cause: cardiac event. Colt had been in his 3rd year at the University of Tennessee, studying physics when the call came. He drove through the night and arrived at the house in the early morning and sat at the kitchen table where the man had taught him to read ground and find water and understand that real presence requires no performance. In the week after the funeral, sorting through the house, Colt found a USB drive in the lining of an old field jacket that hung in the back of the closet. The jacket smelled like military surplus stores and something older. The USB was wrapped in a piece of parachute nylon and secured with a rubber band that had partially deteriorated. He spent 8 months decoding the files. The encryption was built on a personal system, a key constructed from moments and phrases from the years of their training together, things that existed nowhere except in the memory of the man who created it and the board he had shared them with. Each file opened with something Colt recognized. A phrase from a Tuesday morning in the hills above the house. A calibration number from a specific afternoon on the range. The private language of a relationship conducted mostly outdoors, mostly in motion, mostly in the kind of silence that accumulates meaning over decades. When he finally understood what he was looking at, he sat with it for a long time. Then he destroyed the drive. He kept everything it contained in the only place he trusted completely, which was the same place his grandfather had kept it for 20 years. Memory, the most secure storage any of them had ever had access to. 3 months after that, he made contact with the Defense Intelligence Agency through a method Iron Bill had described in one of the files, a protocol so old it predated standard digital infrastructure, routed through a Veterans Affairs office in Knoxville in a way that would look from the outside like a routine inquiry about service records. He had not known, when he did it, whether anyone was still monitoring that channel. Someone was. Now he sat on the edge of his bunk in a facility in the Blue Ridge Mountains and looked at the photograph of the two of them and thought about what understanding enough actually meant and what it had cost the man in the picture to carry it as long as he had. The secure phone vibrated once. A text message. Encrypted channel. Sender masked. They found the ledger. Move faster. He read it twice. Deleted it. Set the phone on the shelf beside the photograph. Outside, the wind moved through the Blue Ridge in that old way, the sound that is not quite sound, the breathing of something that was here before any of it and will be here long after. Colt lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. He thought about a man who burned rice and forgot baseball players' names and carried something heavy and classified and unreported through the last decades of his life and chose at the end of it not to bury it with him. He thought about what it means when a man hands something to the next generation instead of putting it in the ground. He thought about 4 seconds in a dining hall and a colonel who watched from a doorway and said nothing, and a camera pointed 4 degrees off center at a building that was supposed to be empty. He was not here to take tests. He was not here to learn what they were teaching. He was here to finish something that had started before he was born, in a country far from here, in the kind of darkness that governments sometimes create and then forget about the way you forget about a door you sealed shut because you thought what was behind it was too complicated to explain. Colt Mercer closed his eyes. The Blue Ridge breathed outside. And somewhere in the facility, in a building that was not supposed to be operational, a light was on. The morning after the dining hall, Stone did not look at Colt at all. This was more dangerous than when he had looked. A man who looks at you is calculating distance. A man who refuses to look at you has already made his calculation and is waiting for the right conditions. Colt understood this distinction and adjusted accordingly. He did not avoid Stone. He did not watch Stone. He simply remained aware of him the way you remain aware of a loose board on a staircase you use every day. You don't think about it constantly. You know exactly where it is. The facility had its own weather system after what happened in the dining hall. The SEALs and the Rangers and the FBI contingent had all recalibrated, each in their own way, each according to their own internal metrics for what the previous evening meant. Some of them looked at Colt with something that might become respect if it had enough time. Some of them looked at him with the wariness reserved for things that do not fit their established categories. And Reeves had gone quiet in a way that was in its own way louder than anything he had previously said. Calloway appeared at breakfast with his tray and sat down without asking. He said, "You made his list." Colt said, "I know. That is a complicated list to be on." "Most lists are." Calloway ate for a moment. He had the eating habits of someone who had spent enough time in the field to understand that food is fuel and sentiment about it is a luxury. He ate completely and without waste, and then he put his fork down and looked at Colt directly. "I pulled your record," he said, "the official one. Physics degree, no service history, no priors, not even a speeding ticket." Colt said nothing. "The way you moved last night," Calloway said, "the way you read that building before the CQB exercise. Nobody learns that from a textbook. Nobody learns it in a gym." He paused. "Your grandfather was military." "He was." "What branch are he?" Or his Calloway nodded slowly. The way men nod when they are assembling something from pieces they have been given one at a time. He did not ask the follow-up question that was available to him. He seemed to understand without being told that the follow-up question was not his to ask yet. That was the thing about Calloway. He had the patience of someone who had learned probably in Ramadi or Mosul or some narrow street whose name he never said aloud that the most important information arrives on its own schedule. They finished breakfast in silence. The SERE exercise was announced that afternoon. Survival Evasion Resistance Escape. 48 hours. Solo. Blue Ridge Wilderness, October dropping temperatures. Standard issue clothing. No additional equipment. The kind of exercise that is not about whether you can survive the cold in the terrain. It is about what you do when you are completely alone and the gap between what you believed about yourself and what is actually true becomes impossible to avoid. Colt walked into the tree line at 1600 hours. He moved for the first hour without stopping, getting distance from the insertion point in elevation. Iron Bill had taught him that the first choice you make in unknown terrain establishes the logic of every choice that follows. So make it carefully because you are not just choosing a direction. You are choosing a way of thinking. He found running water an hour before dark, followed it upstream to where it pooled behind a natural rock formation that blocked wind from the north and northwest, built a debris shelter in the leeward space between two fallen pines. The debris was wet on the outside and dry beneath. He worked for 40 minutes moving quickly, but not rushing, because haste in shelter construction is how you end up with something that looks complete and performs terribly. He set snares at 3 locations before full dark, using techniques that did not require materials he had not already found on the ground. Wire from his bootlassing. Natural funnel points in the animal paths that the ground itself advertised if you knew how to read, but he slept in intervals 2 hours on 45 minutes alert, the way Iron Bill had taught him, for situations where you were alone and could not afford a full sleep cycle. It was on the second night in the interval between his second and third sleep cycle during the period of complete stillness that the forest achieves at approximately 2 in the morning that he heard movement. Not animal movement. Animals in forests at that hour move in patterns that the forest accommodates. Branches bend, not break. Weight distributes across multiple contact points. The sound signature is absorbed rather than announced. This sound was human. Someone who was trained because the intervals between contacts were disciplined and the direction was consistent, but not trained to move in this specific terrain at this specific temperature because cold tightens muscles and changes the mechanical relationship between a boot and frozen ground in ways that most people's training does not account for. Military boots, not the standard issue pattern of the JCTSP program. Colt lay completely still in his shelter and listened. 2 people, moving in a direction that would take them to a small clearing approximately 200 meters northwest of his position. Not searching, moving with intention, going somewhere specific at a time when everyone in the program was supposed to be operating solo and alone. He did not follow them. He recorded the time in his memory, noted the compass bearing of their movement, and cataloged the specific acoustic signature of their boot soles against frozen ground. Then he returned to his schedule. In the morning before he moved out, he went to the clearing. The ground told him what he needed to know. 2 sets of footprints, both military pattern, but one set with a heel-wear pattern he recognized from the facility, a specific asymmetry that came from a leg-length discrepancy he had noticed in the gait of one person since the first day of intake. He had not attached significance to it then. He attached significance to it now. He also found the impression left by something that had been set down and picked up again. The dimensions were consistent with a hard-sided case of specific proportions. He looked at the dimensions and did the arithmetic. Then he walked back to his shelter, broke camp leaving no trace, and moved toward the extraction point. He arrived 40 minutes ahead of the next trainee. Calloway arrived 20 minutes after him. They did not speak until they were back in the facility in the narrow covered walkway between the range building and Building C, where the ambient noise created enough interference that a conversation at low volume would not carry. Colt said, "The night of the second day, did you hear movement?" Calloway looked at him. "I heard something." "Which direction?" "Northwest. I thought it was a deer." "It was not." Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been looking?" Colt said. "Looking at what?" Calloway almost smiled. It was the expression of a man who recognizes a game he has played before and knows the rules. "All right," he said. "Your call." He walked inside. Colt stood in the walkway and looked toward the auxiliary building at the edge of the tree line. The camera above its door was still angled 4 degrees off-center. It had been that way since intake day. A mounting error persists because nobody fixes it. A deliberate angle persists because there is no reason to fix it. He had been keeping track of the equipment library records for 6 days. It had started as something minor, a habit his grandfather had modeled so thoroughly it had become automatic. When you are in an unfamiliar place, you learn the place. You learn what is supposed to be there and what actually is. The gap between those two things is information. The equipment library operated on a standard inventory cycle, weekly accounting with daily logs of any checked out items. The logs were maintained in a binder near the entrance, not restricted because the items being logged were not classified. They were consumable training materials, ammunition, cleaning supplies, range equipment. On the third night, reading through 3 weeks of back records during the 2-hour study period, Colt found the first discrepancy. It was small. 3 weeks before intake, a quantity of .338 Lapua Magnum cartridges showed a logged use inconsistent with the scheduled live fire exercises for that period. Approximately 40 rounds, less than a standard training box, the kind of number that gets attributed to miscounting and moves on. Except the same discrepancy appeared 5 weeks before that, and 8 weeks before that. Not the same number each time, but the same pattern. Small, consistent, below the threshold of immediate concern. The kind of removal that a careful person would execute specifically because it sat below that threshold. He found that Calloway knew people. Not because Calloway was careless, but because career soldiers accumulate peripheral knowledge the way rivers accumulate sediment continuously without effort until there is more of it than anyone intended. He knew people had overlapping circles of acquaintance that crossed units and deployments in ways that created an informal intelligence network functioning alongside and sometimes more effectively than official channels. Colt asked Calloway without explaining why to confirm Stone's location on 3 specific nights over the previous month. He gave him the dates. He did not give him the reason. Calloway came back the next morning. On each of the 3 nights, Stone had been documented inside the facility, but not in his assigned quarters during the middle portion of the night. He had been somewhere else in the facility. The same somewhere else based on what Colt now understood about the pattern. Calloway said, "If what you are implying is what I think you are implying, this is not theft. You do not steal 40 rounds at a time and maintain a schedule if you are stealing. You do that if you are moving material. There is a difference. One is opportunistic. The other is logistics." Logistics, Colt said. Logistics means planning. Planning means a destination. And a destination means this is connected to something that is not in this building. Colt said, "I know." "How do you know?" Colt was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Blue Ridge was doing what it does in the last light of October, going the color of iron and old copper, the light moving through it at an angle that made the familiar look strange. "My grandfather left me something," he said finally. "I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough to know there was a thread, and the thread led here." Calloway absorbed this in silence. Then he said carefully, "Special forces spend a lot of time in places where the story has a thread, and the thread goes back further than anyone will officially acknowledge. I have pulled on a few of those threads. What happened? Depends on the thread, depends on who is holding the other end." He paused. "What are you going to do with what you found?" "I need to see the administrative server." Calloway looked at him for a long time. "That requires a level 2 access card." "I know. I have a level 2 access card." "I know that too." Another long pause. Calloway reached into his jacket pocket, removed his access card, and held it between 2 fingers. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want a real answer." "Okay. Are the people on the other end of your thread dangerous?" Colt thought about it. Not performing the consideration, but actually performing it. "Depends on which direction the danger goes," he said. Calloway placed the card on the surface between them and took his hand away. "Do not tell me what you find," he said. "Not yet. Tell me when I need to know." The administrative server room was accessible through the records annex between 2200 and 0400 if you had a level 2 card and moved during the 4-minute interval between the automated camera cycling on the corridor's east end. Colt had been timing the cycling pattern for 8 days. He went at 0130. The terminal he wanted accessed the facility management infrastructure rather than the training records. Not the most sensitive system. Not the one a serious intrusion attempt would target. Which was precisely why it retained deleted administrative correspondence in its buffer for 31 days before overwriting instead of the 7-day window the secure systems used. He was not looking for documents. He was looking for patterns. The email traffic in the buffer had been deleted, but deletion from an administrative buffer is not erasure. The metadata remained. Sender address, recipient address, timestamp, file size, not the content, the shape of the content. He found it in 11 minutes. An address associated with the facility's administrative infrastructure mapped to a user ID that the facility's own org chart confirmed belonged to Colonel Dwight Stannard had sent 17 messages to an external address over the preceding 6 weeks. The external address was structured to appear institutional, a government domain suffix. But the domain itself did not appear in any public federal registry. The message sizes were not uniform, but their pattern was. Small messages preceded by larger messages on a cycle of approximately 10 days. Small message first, larger message 3 to 4 days later. Schedule then confirmation. Colt looked at the pattern for a long time. He printed nothing. He photographed nothing. He closed the buffer, logged out, and restored the terminal to the exact state he had found it. He sat for a moment in the dark of the server room. Stannard was not an accessory. An accessory receives information and stays quiet. A coordinator sends information and receives confirmation. Stannard was sending the schedule. Someone outside the facility was confirming receipt. And in the days following confirmation, ammunition disappeared from the equipment library in precisely the quantities the pattern suggested were being communicated. This was not a man who had stumbled into something. This was a man who had been inside something for a long time, who had constructed something that was functioning, that had been functioning before any of these 48 trainees arrived, and that would continue functioning after they left. He walked back to Building C in the cold. He was almost at the door when the secure phone vibrated. Not a message, a call. The encryption indicator showed active. He answered. The face on the small screen was a woman in her late 50s with the kind of composure that does not come from temperament, but from decades of operating in environments where composure is the first professional requirement. Director Sandra Voss, Defense Intelligence Agency. He had met her exactly twice in person, and both times she had given him the impression of someone who had already read the last page of the book you were both in. She said status. He said Stannard is the conduit. Stone is logistics. I have the message pattern, but I do not have the destination. She said, I know you do not have the destination. We need the destination. I need 48 more hours. A pause on her end, not a comfortable pause. Someone accessed the buffer tonight, not you earlier tonight before your access. A secondary query on the same metadata. Whoever runs their counter-intrusion knows they had a visitor. Colt processed this. They do not know it was me. They do not know who it was. That gives you a window, but the window is not 48 hours. Another pause. Mercer, I need you to understand something about what you are looking for. Tell me. She looked at him through the small screen with the expression of someone about to hand a person something heavy. The ledger your grandfather left you. You spent 8 months decoding it. You destroyed the drive. Everything is in memory now. Yes. And what do you think you are looking for based on what that memory contains? A destination, he said. A connection between what is happening here and something older. Older, she said. It was not quite a question. 1993, he said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather spent the last years of his life trying to bring something into the light. He could not do it officially. He tried other channels. When he understood he was running out of time, he made a decision about who to leave it to. He left it to me. He left it to you, not because of what you are now, because of what you were going to become when you understood what he had given you. She paused. The DIA has been watching Iron Bill's file for a long time. When he passed, we shifted our attention to you. We ran your profile, and then something interesting happened. You came to us. This was true. The protocol Iron Bill had described, the channel routed through the Knoxville Veterans Affairs Office, had been monitored for longer than Colt had known. When he sent his inquiry, someone on the other end had been waiting for exactly that kind of signal from exactly that source. You are not here as a trainee, Voss said. You are here to confirm identities. The names encoded in what your grandfather left you, we need to know which of them are still active, who is still inside systems they should not be inside, who is still protecting what happened in 1993 by making sure it continues to officially not exist. Stannard. Stannard is one. His name connects to the 1993 operation, not as a participant, but as a subsequent administrator. He was 26 years old in 1993, a junior intelligence officer at Fort Belvoir. He processed the original classification order for a Somalia operation that July. He did not create it, but he executed it. And when the men who came home from that operation tried to surface in the years that followed, Stannard was one of the people making sure the surface stayed closed. She paused. He has renewed the classification order every 3 years since. It requires his signature. He has given it every time. Why? Because the people who created the original order are still alive and still connected to systems that matter. And because Stannard built his entire career on their goodwill, exposing them would expose him. Another pause. Finish it, Mercer. He trusted you with this for a reason. The call ended. He stood outside for a moment. The October air was sharp and clean. The Blue Ridge held the darkness the way it holds everything massively and without comment. He went inside. The next 3 days required him to operate in 2 registers simultaneously. In the first, attend training, perform assessments, continue existing in the social ecosystem of 48 competitive people. In the second, complete the identification. Stannard was confirmed. There were 2 other names in the encoded files. One was outside the facility and would require a different operation to reach. The other was not outside the facility at all. The other name belonged to a man who had been with the program for 4 years. Not a trainee, staff, a logistics coordinator whose job was inventory management and equipment scheduling. A man whose name appeared in the encoded files connected to the 1993 operation, not as a participant, but as a subsequent beneficiary, someone paid years later to maintain silence about records that had passed through his hands. This was how Stannard was doing it. He was using someone with legitimate access to everything someone compromised long enough ago that the compromise had become simply part of his baseline. Normalized. Unremarkable. On the 4th day after his conversation with Voss, the consequences of the secondary server query arrived. Calloway appeared in the equipment library with an expression carefully controlled in the way that trained faces are controlled when the information they carry requires preparation to receive. He said quietly, "Someone talked to Stone this morning." Not a trainee. Staff. Colt looked up from what he was reading. "Whatever you found in that room, they know someone was looking. They do not know who. But Stone is watching everyone now. Not the way he was watching before. Different." How different? Before he was watching to establish hierarchy. Now he is watching to find something specific. Those are different kinds of watching, and they produce different kinds of behavior. A pause. He is on assignment. Colt closed the manual, put it back on the shelf, looked at the wall for a moment. Then he looked at Calloway. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And after I tell you, you are going to want to ask questions. I am going to ask you to save most of them for later." Calloway crossed his arms, said nothing. "I am not here to complete this program," Colt said. "I am here to confirm something. I have confirmed most of it. What is happening with the equipment, what Stannard's role in it is, where the connection to something older runs. What I do not have yet is the end of the line, the destination, where the material is going and why." Calloway was quiet for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed above them. Outside, the wind pushed against the building in long testing intervals. He said DIA. It was not a question. Colt said yes. Calloway uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "My grandfather served 2 tours in Korea, so on," he said. "He did not talk about it either. When he died, there was nothing to decode. He just took it with him." He paused. "Yours was smarter. Or more stubborn. Usually the same thing." He straightened. "What do you need from me?" "I need access to a vehicle. And I need to know if you are willing to travel 200 miles west on no official authority and no official sanction in the middle of the night based on my read of an incomplete picture." Calloway thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "What is 200 miles west?" "West Virginia, an old facility, Cold War era, officially decommissioned in 1991. Officially. There is a light on in it, has been for longer than I can confirm, and what has been moved out of this facility has been going in that direction." Outside in the corridor, footsteps. Both of them went quiet. The footsteps passed without slowing. Calloway said, "When, tonight if we can, tomorrow night at the latest. I will get the vehicle." He turned to leave, stopped in the doorway without turning around, said to the wall in front of him, "Your grandfather, he sounds like someone I would have wanted to know." Colt said, "He burned rice." Calloway turned his head slightly enough to show that the statement had registered, and something in his profile shifted in a way that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. He walked out. Colt stood in the library for a moment longer. He looked at the shelf where the mountain operations manual sat, the old one from the bottom shelf, the one that gets replaced because the terrain it describes does not change. He pulled it out. On the inside front cover in pencil, so faint he had almost missed it the first time someone had written a coordinate set. Very old. The kind of mark a person makes when they need to store something in a place that will survive them. He looked at the coordinates for a long time. He already knew where he was going. He had known it in some part of himself that dealt in the inherited certainty of blood and taught instinct since the moment he stepped off the transport van and looked at these mountains and felt a particular recognition that has no logical basis but is never wrong. He put the book back on the shelf. Behind him in the administrative corridor, a door closed with the deliberate sound of a door being sealed rather than simply shut. He did not turn around. He walked out into the October afternoon and went to get ready. They came for him at 11 that night. He heard them in the corridor before the knock. 3 sets of footsteps, not 2. The cadence of people moving with purpose but not urgency, which is the cadence of people who believe they have already won the situation they are walking into. The knock itself was unhurried, almost polite. Stone's voice came through the door. "Open up, Mercer. The colonel wants to see you." Colt was already dressed. He had been dressed since returning from the library. In the hours between then and now, he had made 2 preparations he did not plan to explain to anyone in that quarter. The first was a message sent through the encrypted channel containing a single line of coordinates and the word "tonight." The second was a conversation with Calloway, conducted in the equipment bay while checking out cleaning supplies that lasted 90 seconds and communicated everything that needed to be communicated. He opened the door. Stone was there. Behind him, 2 men Colt had not seen in the facility before. Not trainees, not staff from any section he had identified. They wore civilian clothing without logos or identifying features, the specific sartorial neutrality of people whose professional lives require them to be unplaceable. Stone's face was doing the thing Colt had noticed once before, the thing more concerning than anger. He was not angry. He was careful. The careful expression of a man who has been given precise instructions and intends to follow them precisely. "Colonel's office," Stone said. "Let's go." Colt went. The administrative corridor at night was a different place than during training hours. The overhead lights were dimmed to a lower setting that created long shadows between the pools of light. The building was not empty, but the people still in it were behind closed doors, and the institutional quiet of a facility where serious things happen at odd hours surrounded everything. Stannard's office was at the end of the corridor. The colonel was seated behind his desk when Colt entered. The 2 men from the hallway remained outside. Stone came in and stood in the far corner, near the window, with the quality of someone who has been positioned rather than arrived. Stannard did not offer a seat. He looked at Colt for a long moment with an expression entirely composed, entirely professional, and entirely without warmth. He was a man who had spent 35 years inside institutions that rewarded the management of expression, and he had become exceptionally good at it. The face he wore gave away nothing about what was behind it. Only the quality of the silence told Colt that what was behind it was significant. "You accessed the administrative buffer," Stannard said. "Not a question, not an accusation, a statement of established fact delivered the way a man lays a card on a table." Colt said nothing. "The terminal logged the access. The session was brief, which tells me you knew what you were looking for. The fact that you restored the terminal's state tells me you have done this kind of work before." Stannard leaned back slightly. "The question I am asking myself is not whether you looked. The question is what you found, and more importantly, what you brought with you when you came here." Colt said, "I do not know what you are talking about, sir." Stannard almost smiled. The smile of a man who respects a reflex even when it is futile. "You are intelligent. Your grandfather was intelligent. That particular kind of intelligence runs in families in my experience. The kind that sees patterns in things that are not supposed to have patterns." He paused. "Iron Bill was a remarkable soldier. I mean that without irony." The use of the name in that room and that voice produced something in Colt's chest that he did not allow to reach his face. "Tell me where the drive is," Stannard said. "You go home. Simple arrangement. No record of this conversation. No record of your time here." Colt said, "There is no drive." Stannard's expression held. "The USB my grandfather left me contained encrypted files. I spent 8 months decoding them before I made contact with anyone. When I had what I needed in memory, I destroyed the drive." He paused. "You have been looking for a physical object for 2 years. It does not exist anymore." Stannard was quieter for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite belief, not quite disbelief. The expression of a man reassessing the geometry of a situation he thought he understood. "Then you are walking around with everything in your head," he said, "which is where my grandfather kept it for 20 years. Colt said. It worked for him. Stannard looked at Stone. Stone came off the wall. The space in the office was constrained. Desk on one side, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, the window behind Stone. The door was behind Colt. He had already done the arithmetic of the room when he entered it, because it was the kind of arithmetic his grandfather had taught him to do automatically, the way other people's grandparents teach them to check for traffic before crossing. You enter a space, you know the space. Stone moved the way large trained men move when they have committed to action. Directly. Without the preliminary escalation of civilian confrontation. Colt moved toward him. This was the piece Stone did not account for because in every previous confrontation in his experience, the smaller person moved away. The decision to close distance on a larger aggressive opponent required a specific kind of conditioning that had to be built. Iron Bill had built it in Colt over years of patient repetition because he understood that the body's first impulse in danger is retreat, and that retreat in a confined space is almost always strategically inferior. The chair between them became a tool rather than an obstacle. Colt's left hand gripped its back as he moved not to swing it, but to use its geometry to insert its dimensions into Stone's attack vector and buy the half-second of disrupted timing he needed. Stone's first strike glanced off the chair's back. His second was already adjusted, coming lower modified in real time by someone who was not a slow learner. Colt gave ground to the left, let the strike extend, fully caught the wrist at the end of its extension where the mechanical leverage was worse for Stone and best for Colt. What followed was not elegant. It was efficient, which is a different thing. Stone went into the bookshelf. The bookshelf went into the wall. Several things fell. 7 seconds. Stone down, breathing hard, not incapacitated. Colt moved to the window behind Stone's position rather than toward the door, single glazed facing north first floor. He wrapped his left forearm in his jacket and hit the glass at the lower corner where the frame meets the sill, which is structurally the weakest point of a single pane installation. The glass went outward in manageable pieces rather than inward in dangerous ones. He went through the opening before Stannard had crossed the desk. The cold outside hit him immediately and completely. He moved. Calloway was parked on the maintenance track behind Building D. The vehicle was running and the passenger door was already open, which meant Calloway had heard the sound of the window going. They were through the maintenance gate and onto the fire road before any lights in the administrative corridor began to move. Calloway said, "How bad?" Colt said. "Stone is going to have a headache." "Stannard knows I know." "Then we do not come back. Not the way we left." They drove in silence for a while. The fire road connected to a state road after 3 miles, and the state road ran west through the mountains at the kind of grade that demands attention from the driver and produces quiet in the passenger, the silence of watching darkness move past its speed and thinking about what the darkness contains. After a while, Calloway said, "I looked up the coordinates you gave me, Site Kestrel. I called a man I trust who was at Bragg in the early 90s. A pause. He knew it, not officially, the way you know places that existed in the gaps. Where Colt said, "What did he say?" He said there were people who used that facility after it was decommissioned. The kind of use that happens when people have nowhere else to go. He paused. He said some of them had been going there for years, that it had become something, a place to be without being documented. Colt looked at the mountains moving past the window. Did he say who? He said men who came home from something that did not officially happen. Calloway's hands shifted slightly on the wheel. He said they were not dangerous. He said they were tired. They drove through the night. The Appalachian darkness at that hour is total in the way that darkness in populated places never quite is. No ambient light from cities, no glow on any horizon. Just the headlights and the road and the mountains shouldering up on both sides, indifferent, enduring, present in the way that things are present when they have outlasted every human concern ever brought to them. Colt told Calloway the parts he had not told him yet. Not everything, the shape of everything. The encoded files, the 1993 operation, the way his grandfather had carried 30 years of classified knowledge through the last decades of his life, like a man walking with something heavy in his coat that he could not put down and could not show anyone. The DIA connection. Stannard's name in the files and what it was connected to. Calloway listened without interrupting. He listened the way people listen who have been in situations where incomplete information costs lives, who have learned that the most important thing you can do when someone is telling you something is to hear all of it before you respond to any of it. When Colt finished, Calloway drove for a full minute in silence. Then he said, "In Ramadi in 2006 there was a morning. We were holding a position that command had decided was no longer strategically significant, so they redirected our support and issued a retrograde order. He paused. 3 of my guys were still in that building when the order came. 2 of them made it out, 1 did not. A pause. The one who did not was 22 years old and from a small town in Mississippi and had a photograph of his daughter in his helmet. She was 8 months old in the photograph. Colt said nothing. The people in that facility, Calloway said, if what you are telling me is right, if they were left behind, if the thing they came home from does not exist in any record. He stopped, started again. I want to understand who I am meeting before I meet them. So do I, Colt said. I know the shape of it. I do not know the face of it yet. Your grandfather did. He knew one face. He left me the shape. I think the face is waiting at the end of this road. Calloway nodded slowly. The mountains moved past them in the dark. They arrived at the outer perimeter of Site Kestrel 40 minutes before dawn. The facility was set into a hillside in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia in a fold of terrain that made it invisible from any road within 2 miles. It had been built into the hillside deliberately in the early Cold War period when the primary design philosophy for facilities like this one was concealment rather than access. The buildings were low and partially earth-sheltered. The access road had been allowed to deteriorate until it was indistinguishable from a logging track. From the outside in the dark, the place looked like nothing, except for the faint thermal signature of occupied space visible through Calloway's field scope. Occupied space has a heat differential with unoccupied space that is detectable even through insulated walls. Someone had insulated these walls carefully, but not carefully enough for a man who had spent years in places where that differential was the difference between a good decision and a final one. They went to high ground on the eastern ridge, observed for 45 minutes. 11 people. Colt counted them through the cycling of their movement patterns. Guard rotation on a 4-person schedule, which meant the other 7 were either resting or inside. The movement of the 4 was disciplined in a way that was immediately recognizable to both of them. Not the discipline of active duty personnel following current doctrine. The discipline of experienced people who had internalized their training so completely it had become habitual, like breathing or posture. These were people who moved carefully, not because they were told to, but because they no longer knew how not to. Their average age, estimated from gait and movement economy, was somewhere between 50 and 60. Calloway lowered his scope, said quietly, "Those are operators." "I know. Old school. Look at how they position at the corners. That is not current doctrine. That is 80s and 90s SOF. "I know." A pause. "They are not hostile." Colt looked at him. "I have been approaching hostile positions for 15 years. That is not a hostile position. That is a defensive position. There is a difference, and it is not subtle. They are not preparing to attack anything. They are making sure nothing surprises them." He lowered his voice further. "They are afraid." The approach took 40 minutes because they did it correctly. Colt moved the way his grandfather had taught him, using the water drainage patterns to predict where the ground would be soft and quiet underfoot, staying on the downstream side of the ridge where the wind moved away from the facility. Taking time to stop and listen at intervals that would seem excessive to anyone who had not been taught why they mattered. They came in from the northwest corner through a section of the perimeter where the guard rotation had a 17-second gap at the transition point. Colt had timed it 3 times before they moved. Inside the outer structure, the smell was wood smoke and machine oil, and the particular institutional quality of a building designed for function rather than comfort maintained, rather than improved, occupied by people who were there not because they wanted to be, but because there was nowhere else. An old man was sitting in the room at the end of the first corridor. He was sitting by a small iron stove, the door of which was open, and the light from the fire inside it was the only light in the room. He appeared to be in his middle 60s, though his body had the kind of compression that comes not from age but from accumulated physical damage. He was not wearing a weapon, which was the first thing Colt noticed. The second thing was that the man was not surprised to see him. He looked at Colt the way people look when they have been waiting for something for a long time, and it has finally arrived. He said, "You have his eyes, William's eyes." The fire moved in the stove. Colt stood in the doorway and did not speak. The old man said, "We are not terrorists, son. We are the ones they left behind." He did not say it with bitterness. He said it the way you state a fact that has been true for so long that the emotional weight of it has been entirely replaced by simple accuracy. His name was Wallace. He had been in the Army's Special Forces for 21 years, and in July of 1993, he had been part of an operation in Mogadishu alongside 8 other men. one of whom was William Mercer. Colt listened. The operation had targeted financial infrastructure, not combatants. Documents records the paper architecture of a network that was funding activity that would, if left alone, cost American lives later. The mission was successful. But the intelligence that put them there had been compromised at the source, and on the way out they were contacted. 3 men did not come home. Those 3 men were listed in official records as killed in a training accident at a domestic installation because the operation they died on did not exist. Their families received folded flags and condolences that said nothing accurate about where or why or how. The remaining men came home and were told to be quiet. Over 30 years they had found others, men from adjacent operations, parallel circumstances, the particular category of post-Cold War, classified activity that happened in the spaces between the acknowledged conflicts. 11 men now, some of them ill, some of them old enough that the question of time remaining had become immediate rather than abstract. They were not here to attack anything. They had a box of documents assembled over 30 years, from fragments in memory and occasional careful leaks, and they wanted the record to exist, officially, on paper, in a file that could not be indefinitely reclassified because it would already be public. The weapons that came from the JCTSP facility were not for offensive use. 3 months ago, one of their number had been found dead in his home in Wyoming, officially natural causes. But the man had been 61 and healthy, and he had told the others 2 weeks before his death that he had been approached by someone wanting to know where the documents were. They were armed because they had learned at significant cost that being unarmed in their position was not a form of safety. Wallace looked at Colt when he finished. "Your grandfather came to us," he said, 10 years ago, then 5. He was trying to build the record from the outside through channels that kept closing. He gave us what he had. We gave him what we had. He said he would find a way to make sure it survived him. He looked at Colt steadily. "I see he did." Colt said, "There is a man here I need to meet." Wallace looked at him. "Frank Dolan," Colt said. The name moved through the room like something solid. Wallace rose from his chair and led them through the corridor without speaking deeper into the facility, where the earth-sheltered walls made the temperature several degrees warmer, and the sound from outside was entirely absent. A room designed in its original purpose for secure communication. Now it held a folding table, several chairs, and a man sitting with a cup of something warm in both hands, looking at a wall that held nothing visible. Frank Dolan, known in certain circles in certain decades by the callsign Spectre, was 67 years old. He had been a sergeant major in 1st SFODD before the Army officially stopped acknowledging that he had been a sergeant major in 1st SFODD. He had a left leg that did not work at full efficiency, the result of a wound that was not in his medical record because the event that caused it was not in any record. He had a face that had been through every kind of weather a face can go through and had arrived at something beyond expression at a place so thoroughly inhabited that it no longer needed movement to communicate. He looked at Colt the way Wallace had looked at him. With the recognition of a man who has been picturing a meeting for a long time, he said, "I wondered if you would come." Colt sat down across from him. "He talked about you," Frank said. "Not often, but when he did." He looked at his cup. "He said you had his stubbornness." He meant it as a compliment, though he said it like he was not entirely sure. Colt said, "Tell me about July 1993. Frank was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that precedes not reluctance, but precision. The gathering of something stored carefully that must be retrieved with equal care. He said, "We went in at 0200, 8 of us. Your grandfather was on my left the entire approach, which was where I wanted him, because he was the best reader of ground I ever served with, and the route we were using did not appear on any map." He paused. "We found what we were looking for. We extracted it. On the way out, we were contacted. They knew we were there, which meant the intelligence that put us there had been compromised at the source, which meant someone who knew about the operation had told someone who should not have known." Colt said, 3 men died. 3 men died. Frank's hands moved slightly on the cup. "Your grandfather was hit in the retrograde, left side twice. He kept moving because he was the kind of man who kept moving, but he was not going to make the extraction point on his own." He looked up at Colt directly for the first time. "I carried him 2 kilometers, under fire, in the dark." A pause. "I want you to know that I would do it again. Not because I was ordered to. Because he was my teammate, and that is what you do." Colt said he knew. He spent the next 20 years trying to repay it, which is not how it works, but that was the kind of man he was. Frank set the cup down. "When we came home, I went through official channels first. I was young enough then to believe the channels were real. Complaints officer, inspector general, congressional inquiry through my senator's veterans office. Each time the same result. No record, no acknowledgement. The men who died officially died somewhere else for a different reason. I officially have no record of the operation in my service jacket. Stannard, Colt said. Frank looked at him. He was the classification officer, 26 years old in 1993 at Fort Belvoir. He processed the original order. He executed the burial, and he has renewed the classification order every 3 years since. Frank said, yes, we found his name 8 years ago. He was not the origin. He was not the person who decided this operation would be buried, but he was the person who executed the burial, and he has kept his hand on it ever since. He paused. He is also the person who sent someone to Wyoming. The room was very quiet. Calloway said from the wall where he had been standing, you have documentation. Frank said, we have 30 years of documentation, financial records, communication logs, partial transcripts, enough to compel a congressional investigation if it reached the right desk without being intercepted first. He looked at Colt. The problem is that everything we have tried to move through official channels has been intercepted before reaching a desk that mattered, because the people who buried this are still inside the systems the channels run through. Colt said, the encoded files my grandfather left me contain names, not just Stannard. We know who the others are, Frank said. We have always known who they are. Knowing is not the problem. The problem is evidence that exists outside a classified system. Evidence already public before anyone can classify it again. Colt looked at him. That is why I am here. Frank held his gaze. That is why you are here. Calloway pushed off the wall. His face had settled into the expression it wore when he had assessed a situation completely and was now in the part that came after assessment. We have an immediate problem, he said. Stannard knows Colt found the server record. He knows we left the facility. He is not going to call this through official channels because official channels will create a record of what he has been doing. He will come here himself with whatever he has available that operates without leaving that record. Frank said, we know. How long? We have had perimeter sensors on the approaches since last month. There are 2 vehicles that have been running surveillance on the access routes for the past 6 hours. They are not law enforcement. They are not moving like law enforcement. He paused. They will be here within the hour. Colt said, we need to end this tonight. Everyone in the room looked at him. He took out the secure phone. Not with weapons. Stannard needs silence and he needs the documents. If we give him a confrontation, we give him a justification. Armed men in a decommissioned federal facility. He writes the narrative. He set the phone on the table. But if everything he says in the next hour is on a live encrypted feed to Director Voss at the DIA, then the narrative already exists before he can write it. Frank looked at the phone, then at Colt. Something moved through his face that had not been there before. Your grandfather, he said quietly, would have liked this. I know, Colt said. I think he planned on it. What followed was not a battle in the way that battles are usually described. It was a building in the dark occupied by men who had spent careers in places where the difference between the person who controls the terrain and the person who does not is the difference between a conversation and a memorial. Stannard arrived with 6 people in 2 vehicles, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he held every advantage the situation offered. He did not hold the terrain. Frank's 11 men distributed themselves through the facility with the unhurried efficiency of people executing a plan developed over years for precisely this contingency. Not to kill, to contain, to ensure that the space worked against the people coming in rather than for them. These were men who had spent the better part of their professional lives learning to solve problems with the minimum necessary force, and they applied the minimum necessary force. Every one of Stannard's team was accounted for disarmed and held without serious injury. Calloway took the primary entrance alone, standing in the doorway in the cold with his arms crossed in a posture that communicated a complete and detailed understanding of exactly what was on the other side of this moment. Stannard's team stopped at the entrance, looked at Calloway. Stannard came through them. He looked at Calloway and then past Calloway, and then his assessment shifted registers as he began to understand that the geometry of the facility was not what he had expected. He said, "This is over." Calloway said, "Yes, sir, it is." Colt came out of the side corridor. He and Stannard stood in the entrance room, and the phone was in his hand with its encrypted channel open, and everything in the room from this point forward was already somewhere else, already arriving at a desk in Washington where Sandra Voss was listening to every word. Stannard looked at the phone. He was intelligent enough to understand immediately what it meant, and the understanding moved through his face in a way that was almost imperceptible and completely visible to anyone trained to see it. He said, "You do not know what you are protecting." Colt said, "Tell me," and Stannard in the way that men sometimes talk when they understand the conversation is already over, and the only thing left is the record told him. Not everything, but enough. The name of the man above him, the mechanism of the classification renewals, the authorization trail that led from a desk at Fort Belvoir in 1993 to a desk in a private security consultancy in Northern Virginia in the present day. The things that had needed to be said for 30 years were said. When it was over, Stannard sat down in a chair that someone had placed in the room for that specific purpose, and he looked at the floor and he did not speak again. Then in the outer corridor, Calloway appeared at the doorway and gestured with his chin toward the far end of the hall. Marcus Dolan was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, wrists secured in front of him. He had come with Stannard's team, not as an enforcer, as something else. His face held the expression of a man who has just seen from the outside, and for the first time, the true shape of the thing he has been part of. And it is nothing like what he was told it was. Frank came out of the inner room. He stood in the corridor doorway and looked at his son for a long moment. Marcus looked up at his father and said nothing. Frank said nothing. The corridor was quiet in the specific way corridors get quiet when the people in them are witnessing something that is not their business and they understand it completely. Frank crossed the corridor. He lowered himself carefully, the bad leg taking longer than the good one, until he was sitting on the floor next to his son. Their shoulders were nearly touching. Marcus said, "I did not know you were here." Frank said, "I know that I thought." He stopped, started again. "Stannard told me the weapons were for a private security contract. He never said where they were going." Frank was quiet. "Dad," the word came out with the specific weight of a word that a grown man does not use often, that costs something when it surfaces. "I would not have." "I know," Frank said again, quietly, without judgment. The voice of a man who has spent 30 years being disbelieved by institutions and has therefore developed an acute ability to recognize when someone is telling him the truth. Marcus looked at the zip ties on his wrists. "What happens now?" "You cooperate," Frank said. "Fully. Everything you know about Stannard. Everything you moved. Every contact. You give them all of it." And after, Frank did not answer immediately. He looked at the wall in front of them at some middle distance that contained things no one else in the corridor could see. "After depends on you," he said finally. "Not on me, not on them." He paused. "But I will be there, for whatever after looks like." Marcus closed his eyes, the specific expression of someone releasing something that has been held at great cost for a long time. Frank put one hand briefly on his son's arm. Then he got back up slowly and walked back to the inner room without looking at anyone. Calloway appeared at Colt's shoulder and said nothing. Sometimes that was the right response. Sometimes the right response was simply to be present and let the moment be what it was. Director Sandra Voss arrived at Site Kestrel at 5:40 in the morning with a legal team and 2 federal marshals and the specific kind of paperwork that means what is happening here is real and on the record and not going anywhere. She was small and precise and looked at everything in the facility with the thoroughness of someone sent to see it accurately and report it accurately, which had been her profession for her entire adult life. She looked at Colt for a moment. Then she looked at Frank Dolan. She said, "Sergeant Major Dolan, I want you to know that the documentation your team has compiled is being transferred to a congressional oversight channel tonight. Not a classified channel, a congressional channel with a public disclosure mandate." She paused. "That means it becomes part of the public record before any classification order can be applied to it." Frank looked at her for a long time. He said, "The men who died." She said, "Their families will be notified within the week. Their service records will be corrected. Their names will be added to the appropriate memorials." Frank looked at the wall, at nothing, at something. He said, "It took 30 years. She said, "Yes, it did. I am sorry for that." He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man completing something. In the outer corridor, Marcus Dolan sat on the floor and waited for what came next. And for the first time in a long time, the expression on his face was not the expression of a man maintaining something under pressure. It was the expression of a man who had put something down. Colt drove east as the sun came up. He had said goodbye to Frank at the door of Site Kestrel while Voss's team was still processing the facility. Frank had shaken his hand, not the way men shake hands at formal occasions, but the way men shake hands when they mean it, both hands firm and brief. What happens to them, Colt had asked, meaning the 11. The army will move slowly, Voss had said before Frank could answer. Bureaucracies always do, but it moves in one direction now, forward. Frank had looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to believe something. Then he had looked at Colt. He would have wanted to see this, he said. I know, Colt said. I think he did see it. In his own way, he just needed someone to finish the carrying. Frank held his gaze for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket and took out a photograph. He held it between them without quite releasing it yet. It was not the same photograph Colt carried. Different moment, different light, different configuration. 8 men in desert and tropical clothing, standing in the early morning before a building that Colt did not recognize. Every face young, every face wearing the particular expression of men who have done what they came to do and are about to go home before they know what home is going to cost them. Iron Bill was second from the left. Frank Dolan was beside him. On the back, in handwriting, Colt recognized by the pressure of it the familiar pressing of pen against paper of a man for whom words were serious objects. Mogadishu, July 1993. We did our job. Frank released the photograph. Colt held it for a moment. He looked at his grandfather's face in that image, young, straight-backed, live with the particular quality of a man who has done something real and knows it. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket beside the photograph he had carried all this way. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying. He shook Frank's hand one more time. Then he walked to the vehicle. Now he drove east into the rising light, and he let his mind be quiet for the first time in weeks. Not empty, it was never empty, but quiet in the way of a task completed of weight set down after a long carry. He stopped once at a pull-off on the Virginia side of the mountains where the road crested and the valley opened below him to the east. He got out in the cold morning air, stood with his hands at his sides. He took out both photographs and held them together. The one he had carried since before he came here, and the one Frank had given him an hour ago. 2 moments from the same life separated by 40 years of service and silence, and a war that had no official name. He looked at his grandfather's face in both of them for a long time. He did not speak aloud. There was nothing to say aloud. But something in him, something that had been held at a specific tension for the entire duration of this released. Not dramatically, the way a held breath releases, simply, completely, without remainder. He put both photographs in his jacket pocket side by side. He got back in the vehicle and drove home to Tennessee. He arrived 2 days later in the early afternoon when the autumn light in that part of the state comes in at an angle that makes everything look the way it might look in a memory, warm and specific and already a little distant, as if the present is always slightly in the process of becoming the past. He drove to the cemetery first. It was a small cemetery at the edge of town, the kind that has been there long enough that the oldest stones have gone gray and rounded, and the names on them are barely legible, and the newest stones are still sharp-edged and specific. Iron Bill's stone was in the middle section beneath a red oak that had dropped most of its leaves, and the grave was tended in the way that graves are tended when someone who loves the person is still nearby and still coming. He stood in front of it for a while. At the base of the stone, sheltered from the wind by the stone's own shadow, there was a bundle of wildflowers that had not been there the last time he came. Dried now, a few days old. No card, no note, no name. Someone who knew what the stone said and what the man beneath it had done and had come in the early morning to leave something that did not require explanation. Colt looked at the flowers for a long time. He did not try to find out who left them. Some things are not mysteries to be solved. Some things are simply the world at last doing what it should have done a long time ago quietly without ceremony, the way serious things are done when they are finally done right. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out both photographs and set them carefully against the base of the stone in the same sheltered space beside the flowers. He weighed the corner of each one with a small stone so they would not blow away. He looked at the image of his grandfather young and straight-backed in the desert light. He looked at the boy on the soldier's shoulders laughing with his whole face. He looked at the handwriting on the back of the first photograph, the handwriting he had known all his life, heavy and deliberate. A man who pressed hard on paper because he pressed hard on everything. Never quit. He said quietly to no one, and to the only person he was speaking to, "We did our job." He stood there for a while longer. The red oak above him moved in the autumn wind, and the last of its leaves came down around him in the unhurried way that leaves fall when there is no rush, when the season has already been decided, and the only remaining work is completion. Then he walked back to his truck. He drove home through the Tennessee afternoon, through the small towns and the long stretches of open road and the hills that were going the colors of the season, and he drove with the windows down, despite the cold, because the air was the kind of air that a person should not seal themselves away from, the kind of air that has been here a long time and knows things and offers them freely to anyone paying attention. He thought about 11 men in a Cold War facility in West Virginia, sitting in rooms that smelled like wood smoke and machine oil, waiting for a record to be written that would say simply and officially and permanently, "We were here, we did what we were sent to do, and this is what happened to us afterward." He thought about Marcus Dolan sitting on a corridor floor with his wrists secured, looking at his father, and the particular word a grown man uses when he is finally able to say it without performance. He thought about Calloway somewhere behind him, on the same roads, driving back to whatever his life had been before this and whatever it would be after. He thought about a junior intelligence officer at a desk in Fort Belvoir in 1993, 26 years old, processing a classification order that he must have understood even then was not simply a bureaucratic function, but a decision, a choice to make certain men invisible, to fold them into the space between official history and the truth, and how that one decision had compelled 30 more years of smaller decisions, each one necessary to protect the first, until the weight of them had become a structure he lived inside and could not see from the outside anymore. He thought about the USB drive he had held in his hands, in a house in Tennessee, wrapped in parachute nylon, secured with a deteriorating rubber band inside the lining of an old field jacket that smelled like a life fully lived. He thought about the 8 months of decoding the private language of shared mornings and afternoons on hillsides and ranges that his grandfather had built into the encryption, not as a puzzle, but as a final act of teaching. Even this, the last thing, was a lesson. Even this required the student to have been paying attention. He thought about what it means to be trusted with something. Not just trusted with information, trusted with the obligation that information creates, trusted with the understanding that knowledge is not passive, that it does not sit quietly and wait for convenient timing, that when a man gives you something real, he is also giving you the responsibility to do something real with it. Iron Bill had understood this. He had understood it so thoroughly that he spent the last decade of his life building the mechanism by which the responsibility would transfer even after he was no longer present to ensure it. He had understood that he was running out of time before he ran out of time, and he had used what remained with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything. Never quit. Not a command, a description, a statement of what he had observed in the boy on his shoulders and had spent the next 16 years carefully, patiently ensuring would remain true. The light changed as Colt drove. The West Tennessee light changes in late October, going golden and then amber, and then the deep particular orange that precedes the last hour before dark, when everything is illuminated from below as much as from above, and the familiar looks briefly like it is being seen for the first time. He pulled into the driveway of the house. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. The house was the same house it had always been, in the way that houses absorb the people who live in them and hold them even after those people are gone, so that returning to a place is always also a kind of returning to the person who shaped it. The shed at the back where the workbench was. The kitchen window through which the light came in at a specific morning angle that he had been seeing all his life. The red oak at the edge of the property that was somewhat larger than the one in the cemetery, somewhat more settled into its place, somewhat more committed to being exactly where it was. He went inside. The kitchen smelled like a kitchen that had not been used for several weeks, but had been kept clean the way he kept it, the way he had been taught to keep things. He put a pot of water on the stove. He was going to make rice. He was almost certainly going to burn it, and he understood this, and he did not particularly mind. Some inheritances are practical. Some are simply true, and being true is enough. He stood at the window while the water heated and looked out at the shed and the tree and the light that was finishing its daily transaction with the Tennessee sky, and he felt the particular quality of silence that exists in a house where someone important used to be and is no longer, but where the important things they left behind are being taken care of. The water began to move in the pot. He stayed where he was a moment longer. Somewhere in Washington, in a building on a street with a public name and operations with classified ones, Sandra Voss was writing the first of what would become many reports, each one more complete than the last, each one moving through channels that led toward a day when 11 names that deserved to be in a public record would be in a public record, and 3 names that deserved to be on a memorial wall would be on a memorial wall, and a classification order that should have expired 30 years ago would be officially, permanently, irreversibly closed. It would take time. It would not be simple. Bureaucracies do not move quickly even when they move in the right direction, and the people whose careers had been built on the continuation of a particular silence would spend what leverage they had remaining trying to slow the inevitable. But it was inevitable now. The channel was public. The record existed. The narrative had been written before anyone who wanted to suppress it had the opportunity to write a different one. Colt Mercer had done what he came to do. He turned back to the stove and paid attention to the water, and thought about the rice and thought about his grandfather standing in the same kitchen, failing at the same task, utterly unconcerned about the failure because the failure was the company of it, the ordinary, imperfect, daily human company of a man who had done extraordinary things and came home to a kitchen and a pool and an evening and a life. The water boiled. He added the rice. He did not watch it carefully enough. Outside, the last light went out of the Tennessee sky, and the stars came on one by one in the dark above the hills, and the night settled over everything, the way nights settle over things that have waited long enough and can finally rest. The rice burned. He ate it anyway.